Okay, so welcome, Simas. Thank you for having me here. To begin with, I'm super excited to be coming back to this conference. The first time I've been here was, I think, the very first conference many years ago, so it's really great to come back. Today, I want to talk about ideas, and let's get right into it. So, what's going on? There seems to be never lack of great ideas, some game-changing ideas. Teams, what I've noticed, they can generate really good ideas, and but they keep on dying. You know, they develop, they keep on working on the ideas, they abandon them halfway, they get half done in the end, and then they rush to do some new things. So what's going on here? Apparently, there's a little secret hiding in plain sight, and I want to talk about that. But first, I want to tell you a little story of how I got here in front of you today. So my name is Simas. I'm an executive producer at Raw Fury, an indie publisher. I have the privilege of working with some of the most interesting titles and indie titles across the globe, and some of the most exciting developers with their wacky ideas coming to life. And but I wasn't always working in the games, even though I always, not always, but like since my teenage years, I always dreamed of working in games. But the reality in Lithuania was a bit different. So I studied computer science, and I thought, okay, well, let's learn to code, and let's make some games. Just to realize that at that time, the game dev industry in Lithuania and in Vilnius was very small to say the least. And I ended up working in corporate software, which many people love. I met amazing people. However, I kept feeling that it wasn't me. You know, it wasn't for me. So it kind of failed, and I said, like, okay, let's try something else. I tried some music. Well, clearly, as you know, making it in the music industry is not that easy as well. Then we founded a business with a couple of friends, and like many first founders of their first businesses, they reach the dire consequences very soon. And we saw the same. So that didn't work out very well. But then a friend of mine approached me and says, like, hey, I heard you're looking for something new, for something more exciting. And we have a studio that we're building. It's growing a little bit, and we're looking for someone to help manage all the projects. And I told him, like, I don't know nothing about making games. Like, heck, I even don't know how to project manage stuff. Like, I've done things as a hobby, project management, but never done it professionally. But he's like, yeah, just come on, come for an interview. Like, let's have a chat. And henceforward, I spent the last 13 years with working with amazing teams in game and industry. So that company that I mentioned for was a company called On5. It was one of the early companies in Lithuania working on mobile games. It was right before free to play even happened, so it was a while ago. Um, and like many, even today, like many developers, the company worked both on making their own titles, but also like doing code dev, work for hire for other companies. So it was a very sort of familiar setup, or hopefully a very familiar setup to a lot of you. But then I moved on to working on some other games like Candy Crush and then at King and some other games with quite a few other companies. And I've had the privilege of working on close to 30 games right now. Um, some of them never reached daylight. Some of them came out. Some of them were successful. Some of them were less successful. But one thing that was evident, that making games is hard, like really, really hard. And to my surprise, most teams are just winging it. You know, they're just like, we have a great idea, let's rock it. And it kind of, a lot of times it just flops. So um, I kept seeing the same struggles. You know, timelines were slipping, execution wasn't where it was supposed to be. The teams were eventually feeling a bit overwhelmed, to say the least. There was conflicts going on. It's like, oh, I'm never being listened to. Like you're calling all the shots. My ideas are never listened. They kind of felt not really good about it. There were a lot of games and a lot of feature ideas which kept falling flat, and eventually, a lot of those teams reached what many teams even today are reaching, and that is end of the cache or end of stakeholder support, and that never ends well. So there are a few traps that I've noticed that teams kept falling into, and I classify them into three three big categories, so to speak. So first one is around decision making. The second one is about production pipelines, and the third one is about organizational discipline. Nothing groundbreaking, I know, but let's talk about it. So when it comes down to decision making, a lot of teams tend to don't have a specific model how they discuss and make decisions, either on how to work, which path to take forward, which idea is better than the other, and there are usually two extremities that I've noticed. It's either some sort of a consensus-driven model where a team comes together and says like, oh, let's discuss all the cons and pros and let's pick an idea that everyone's happy with. The problem is you end up with what I call design by committee, and that's a death sentence a lot of times for a lot of great ideas. Great ideas require clear vision and leadership to pull through that vision. Another extremity is like on the completely opposite end of the scale was when you have good leadership, but that leadership ends up sort of calling all the shots, and it undermines the team, and over time it disempowers them. Basically, team members feel like they're just a pair of hands doing what whoever's the leader is, and yeah, and then it's probably better set up compared to the first problem because at least something gets done. But most ideas are within multiple people. Like if all ideas are coming just from one person, you're missing out on a lot of great stuff. And finally, there's a little flavor to both of these, and that is sort of the uncertainty of who's making decisions, especially with bigger teams. When I worked at Candy Crush, well, it was Candy Crush Soda, so their second biggest team, we had around 7 feature teams, both remote and in-house, plus a lot of support teams. So it was like over 100 people working on a simple game, which sounds crazy, but that's how it is. And a lot of times throughout all of those teams, people would find themselves like unsure, like, can I make this decision? Do I need to get someone's permission? It's like, is it okay to change the product here? Like, so there's a lot of these issues, and especially the bigger the team grows, the bigger this pain becomes. Like if your team's 3 people, it's pretty straightforward. If your team's 2 people, there's no decisions to be made. Like you just like, yeah, bounce the ideas, you're going forward. If you're 20 people, you're in trouble. So you need to pay really close attention to that. The next one is the pipelines. And by that I mean is like what is the process you're taking into how exactly are you gonna take the idea and create it into something workable. And I've noticed a lot of teams, they just pick an idea and they rush into implementing that idea. Sometimes they do UX design on the way. Most teams QA. Most teams are really good at QAing. They will find all the technical issues and they kind of call it a day. Then they move on to the next idea. The problem is that there is lack of granularity into this, and there is lack of details that cause all sorts of problems. For one simple reason, because the difficulty is almost always in execution. Coming up with ideas, if you have a creative bunch of people, they will come up with really great ideas. However, taking those ideas, designing them, and creating into something fun for the players, something that you can ship, is where the most difficulty lies most of the time. And the last bit is the organizational discipline and staying consistent with your approach. So teams sometimes take some sort of approach, be it Scrum, be it Kanban, be it some sort of a mix of everything, and they rush to it. They start running before they can walk. And Some people follow through. Some people are very diligent. Some people are following the agreements. And some people just start as like, doesn't matter. Let's just get stuff done. Think less about the process, and then get it done. Over time, it becomes a bit lack of oversight, and then teams fall into chaos of winging it, like just every time just doing it however they feel it without thinking of the agreements they had in the past. And you might ask, well, Simas, what's going on here? Like, if it's working for the teams, why fix something that's not broken? The problem is, like, you probably came up with those agreements for a reason, and if you want to change those agreements, go ahead and change those agreements, but follow them. And that's, in the end, it's a bit of a slower process, but it really helps you execute on the ideas more successfully. But there's good news. So the good news is there are solutions for all of these, and they're quite obvious, but still, let's talk about them. So I want to offer 4 deceivingly simple things. They might seem super simple, but they require quite some effort to pull through. So first is looking through the pipelines and making a very granular pipeline. Like I'm talking really granular, from how you put ideas into backlog, into how your artists are converting reference art into shippable assets. Like, you need to have pipelines for each part of your operation, and it needs to be pretty clear. The second part comes back to the decision making, and you need to have clear decision makers identified or pre-identified for each part of those pipelines. Otherwise, people will wonder of what's, who's deciding if this art piece is good enough. Who's deciding if this UX flow is better than the other? And you could say, like, well, we have a UX designer, he's the one deciding. You might think that, but other person might think something else. So you need to have a clear agreement on that one. And whichever approach you take, you need to be very consistent. And so that requires the operational discipline. It's like, no excuses. If you have a plan, stick to it. And if you don't like it, you can change the plan. And last bit is what I call consent-driven decision making. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So you probably noticed that when you have a disagreement in a team, you would sometimes have people who, I support this idea, I hate this idea, but then in the end you pick one path or the other. And but that means you're moving forward with some people not supporting the idea or kind of being forced to do the idea. There's a better way of doing it. So you can imagine the scenario of introducing a middle ground. And that middle ground is like, I don't support it, but I'm willing to try. And as a leader of the team, or whichever work stream that you're doing, your job is to convert all of those negative opinions into something that's, I'm willing to try, and if it doesn't work, we're going to try it your way. But the idea is, like, this allows for everyone to be at least borderline on board with what you're doing. So here's a snippet from a past team that we used to work on a mobile narrative detective point and click kind of game. It never reached daylight because we reached end of stakeholder support, as I mentioned before. But so here's a snippet of how we would approach from game vision all the way to something that's ready to implement. Not implemented, but ready to implement. And again, I'm not going to go through this. You can look into this deck afterwards. I think it will be shared. But the idea is that it's pretty granular, and it has all the decision makers or arbiters of, in case of a disagreement, identified. It would really help us to consistently identify ideas, create designs for them, and flesh them out to a degree where they're ready to go into sprints and be implemented. Okay, I think there's a little story I want to tell with all of this. So I've had the privilege of being a part of many training courses, many exercises. A lot of them were about team efficiency, how to do better, how to reach greater results, and yeah, some of them were effective, some of them fell completely into like out of memory, unfortunately. But there was one exercise that I remember very clearly. So on a cold October morning some years back, kind of similar like today, we were doing an exercise with the team where the coach asked us, okay, can you group up in groups of like 7 to 10 people? And everyone was given a little soft ball and says like, okay, your goal of all of this is to throw that ball or pass that ball as many times as you possibly can within a given amount of time. Pretty simple, right? Ball, a bunch of people, pass it on a couple of times. And everyone was like, yep, all right, sounds pretty simple. And but then the coach put on a timer on it. He was like, all right, you get 30 seconds. He's like, ready, go. And it was mad dash. People were excited. People were, you could see joy, you can see laughter. People were trying to throw the ball, give the ball, pass the ball. But then soon enough, the timer ran out and the coach was like, okay, how many times did you throw the ball? And of course, some people said, or some groups said, 10 throws, some groups were 20 throws and so on. And he said like, okay, this was a test run. Let's do this for real. 2 minutes, same thing. Let's go. And the team started doing the same. There were a couple of more rounds of the same thing. But one thing started becoming very obvious, that the number of throws and passes was always the same. It didn't improve, it didn't increase. There was like literally no progress. People were just doing the same thing. And the coach asked, what have you done about the score? And people were just awkward silence. People didn't understand the question. And the coach said, have you discussed how exactly you're going to throw the ball? Like, are you going to pass it to the next person? Or are you going to throw the person to the one directly across you? How are you going to do that? And many people started saying, it's like, well, there was a timer. We just had to throw it as many times as possible. It's like, no one had the time to think about like how you're going to throw a ball. Plus, it's a ball. Who doesn't know how to throw a ball? And another person said, oh, we're too busy. We're just like throwing the ball. Like there was no time to think about it. And here on was the real, sort of the real learning of that exercise, was people were too busy throwing ball to kind of sit back and reflect. And for me, this was very profound because I saw this with teams all the time. They were so busy with their day-to-day activities, with their sprint, with their retrospectives, with everything else, just grinding through the process, really not coming back to think about the process. Like, is their process good enough? Yeah, you could say like, sure, there's retrospectives. Shouldn't you talk about that in a sprint retrospectives? And many teams do. But there's marginal impact from what I've noticed. So games are art, right? At least the way I understand it. Games are art. They're a form of art. And it's beautiful because it's intertwined art. It's some sort of interactive play wrapped into beautiful visual art, wrapped into amazing tech tools, and in some cases weaved into stories that really gives us an opportunity to experience that. And I've always said that ideas are not worth much if you can't execute on them. So you can come up with the brightest idea. If you can't execute on those ideas, they're not really worth much. So I want you to take 4 takeaways out of this. Is first, take very good care of your pipelines. Build the pipelines, identify them, identify decision makers for everything. Stay disciplined, right? Remind yourself about, sometimes it just takes reminding yourself like, oh, okay, I need to follow what was agreed upon too. And lastly, and very, very importantly, be honest about your team's abilities, right? There's a lot of pride, and be honest about it and get support. There's a lot of support you can get for, and you're gonna benefit from that. And if you do these things, I can promise you, you'll see far, far more ideas coming to light, to daylight, and yeah, you'll delight players with many more amazing experiences. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very beautiful Halloween theme. I completely forgot that it will happen soon. Questions? Do we have somebody who would like to ask something?
There's a question up front.
Thanks, Simas, for that great presentation. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to smaller studios, or like indie teams, do you have any suggestions about what you think is the ideal team setup, or at least the bare minimum that a team should have in place to kind of execute effectively?
I would say yes, but it highly depends on what kind of game you're making. By the bare minimum, you'll need at least someone who's tech savvy, right? So unless you're gonna chat GPT everything, then probably you'll need someone with tech abilities. And so if we're talking about, let's say a team is making a small puzzle game, right? And then the ideal setup would be to pick a leader first of the team, right? Like leadership is extremely important, and someone who can hold the vision, right? Like it all starts with a vision. Like if you don't have a clear vision, it will be really difficult for the team to reach successful results or like just excellence in what they're doing. So I think that there's no straight answer to this. Unfortunately, it highly depends on the talent available in the team, and what they're trying to achieve. But the things that I mentioned before are like still stand. Like from the people you have, you need to construct very clear processes of how you're gonna take ideas, convert them into something useful, and put that in a build and get it out. So like you need to have clear processes, regardless of how the teams themselves structure, and pick a decision model, right? Like how you're gonna decide on things. Like if you're 4 people, as I said, 3 or 4 people, usually decisions go really quickly. Like if you're 7, 10 people, it becomes more problematic. So I know this doesn't answer your question directly, so sorry about that. But I'm just trying to say like it's very case by case basis, and it depends on how you on what you're doing and what the talent is available, especially for indie devs who usually don't have the luxury of hiring all the entire world.
Thanks. Okay, let's go from front.
Thank you, Simas. I really wanted to continue the conversation about the decision makers and decision making in like a larger sense when the team is a bit larger. Can you tell us a little bit like what kind of effective decision making have you seen before? How do those decisions happen, and how do they kind of involve the team for them to be involved as well, but come to a consensus basically?
Right. I'm glad you mentioned consensus, and like I think I'm a strong advocate sort of to try to steer away from that and move into what I call consent rather than consensus. So just want to iterate on that one, and like I want to use an example, for example, to show that. So artwork and like game art is something that everyone in your team will have an opinion about, right? Like if you're working on a character, should it be this design for the character, that design of the character? Everyone on the team most likely will have an opinion, and you want to make sure those opinions are heard. So in a case where you're trying to decide which will be the design for them, you can either pick a model where you involve the team, you sit down, let's say together at a table, and if you've enabled and identified the art director as the one like the arbiter, the final decision maker, like in case of a disagreement, I would imagine them proposing of which option should be the one to go through and have very good arguments for it, right? Like not just like, oh, I like this. Like it's good because of this and this and this and this and that. And if there's people who disagree, you would also it would need to be more constructive. Like you disagree because of this and this and this and that. If it's valid, sure, it needs to be incorporated and maybe another option then picked. But if it's more of an opinion, I like this rather than and no strong opinions, then whoever is the decision maker should try to convince them, okay, let's try this character design. Let's go with that, put it in the build, throw a playtest, see how players react to it. If it doesn't work, you can call me out, told you so, and we're gonna take your suggestion afterwards. So it's that the consent-driven decision making what it does is essentially gives people who disagree with the chosen path a sort of right to try and a right to kind of psychological safety to come back to it later on. So it's like, okay, we tried this, my idea is heard. People are not just steamrolling my opinions as well, like my opinion matters as well. We're just trying this first. So that would be an example.
I have a question about the execution paralysis that you've mentioned. One of the things you mentioned is like, when people are deep in tasks and they just keep doing and doing, they don't really have time to think. About that, what would be a good solution to give people a space to reflect on like the work they've done, maybe find new creativity and ideas out of it? Because this is something we've noticed in our studio as well. When we're rushing from milestone to milestone or release to release, a lot of the times, the time to stop, think, and like really open your mind to new things is like it just doesn't come unless you go on a holiday or something. At least that's what happens with me. I just
pretty often, yeah.
At a holiday, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I never thought of that, and then that makes more sense now. So, what is your idea and approach in giving that space to people so they can reflect better on their work?
So I think, great question, by the way. I think first thing is to reflect that everyone's process in the team, everyone has probably a different way of thinking and a different way of, their brains will be organized slightly differently. So for some people will be like, you go on a holiday, that's when you come up, when you're not sort of introduced to the stress of day to day. For some people will be just, grab a coffee, go for a walk, and then some people will just keep on writing things on their notepads. I think the solution is to first identify the differences, right? And it's like what would be the most effective solution? And I've told this a couple of teams that were less than 15 people, and what I said to them was, like, if you're less than 15 people, you have the luxury to accommodate every single person, like individually, right? Like to take into consideration of your preferences. So I think identifying those preferences, if that's the case, and then agreeing on a time where these things should be discussed. And most importantly, you need to create action points. And most importantly is someone needs to take full accountability and making sure that those points are pushed, because way too often you're going to have a retrospective. People will vent properly. There will be solutions put into place. Comes next sprint, everyone forgot about those action points, and then it just keeps them biting in the ass. So I think it's that organizational discipline, is like sticking to what you've agreed to, but it requires active participation, not just flowing with the process you've chosen. Like, it needs to be active.
Okay, yeah, we have quite many, so I'll try to go from here, I guess.
So I have a question. Since you said that game is sort of an art form, so would you say, or have you noticed any practices where for these sort of strategies, game developers borrow from other forms of art? And could it be helpful in your opinion? Thank you.
Absolutely. I would say I've noticed a lot of difference, a lot of similar. So first, games, the way I view it, it's part of entertainment business rather than the tech business. So there's a lot of things to borrow from the movie industry, how they're setting things up, the good examples. There's plenty of examples of how that doesn't work, but from there, and there's a lot of video production, like houses that do ads and things like that, that have also good processes that can be incorporated. Yet again, there's a lot of toxic companies, but there's good examples. And when I said games are art, like, I mean it as a separate form of art, right? Like, I truly believe that games, like, as a finished piece, deserve a place in this world, either to send a message, to inspire people, sometimes for aesthetic purposes, sometimes just for, it creates other ideas. So I think, like, looking at the parallel entertainment industries can give a lot of inspiration.
Thank you.
Hey, I wanted to continue the consent conversation. You mentioned that what you tell people is basically, let's try this idea first, and if it doesn't work, we can try other ideas. The problem I found working with some teams, with all teams basically, is that most ideas when it comes to game design are usually disprovable if they work or not. Like, if the game succeeds, it doesn't mean that that particular idea was good, you know. And we haven't yet found a good way to measure it, and I kind of don't believe there is a good way to measure if a particular idea works by itself. So my question would be, how do you determine if the idea was good or not once you have implemented it?
I think it all depends on what you want to achieve that, and you need to be very, very clear with that, right? Like if you're creating a feature, you need to have a very professional look at it and understand, not just from an artistic perspective what you want to achieve with it, but like what is that going to do? Like if you're working on game design and you're introducing certain features, okay, is that going to improve the core experience of the game? Is that going to enhance players' motivation towards staying more in the game through, you know, maybe building a deeper meta game or whichever feature there? So I think first key is identifying what as precisely as you can, what exactly do you want to achieve with that? Sometimes it's measurable. Sometimes it will be like more of a gut feel, like that you play it, you feel like, there's something in it, right? Like there's something in it. You can't explain it, but there's something in it, and then you'll know, like, probably others will feel the same. But as you said, especially when it comes down to things that everyone will, or crafts that everyone will have an opinion, game design, you know, art, audio design, like these will be the areas where you have the most opinions from people who maybe are not the professionals in the field, but they've seen obviously a lot of other games. They have formed their opinion. It's a lot of preferences based. So like, especially with game design, I think you need to clearly define who's the ultimate decision maker and try to build enough trust in the team, saying that, you know, let's trust this person, right? Like at least to try the opinion, and because of these arguments, and because we know or at least we've tried to identify what we want to achieve. If we have achieved that, then we know that was a good solution. And then of course you can discuss why other solutions were not, or potentially not, good enough. Or maybe you'll see like, okay, this works, but maybe that other would work even better. That creates an opportunity for a conversation, saying it's like, okay, we tried that, it kind of worked, but maybe let's try it again with this one again, and maybe this is going to work even better. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think like clear decision makers, building trust, which is the absolute hardest part, like especially once it's broken, into willingness to try, are those keys there, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We had more, yes?
Hello. My question is, do you think that even for smaller teams or companies, it is important to have detailed pipelines, and maybe how the smaller team could create one?
I think it depends on how small we're talking. Like if we're talking less than 10 people small, or are we talking less than 3 people small? Like, so I think it's if we're talking, let's take a middle ground, like 7-ish, right? I still believe it's important, right? And let me explain why. I believe that there is a benefit from trying to avoid rushing production, right? Because a lot of times you'll have teams who are very excited by an idea. Someone comes up with an idea, they're like full of energy. Let's go. Let's use this creative momentum. Let's pull it through. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, without any reflection, without any sort of processes, but like they just somehow pulled through, and there's another idea and they do it all over again. I've noticed there's value in consistency, and you don't have to start with having a complete pipeline ironed out. What I've noticed, pipelines are usually built over time. And the detail granularity to that is also added over time. Sometimes you'll usually start with a very simple pipeline. Like it's going to be pretty simple. And as long as you're following it and like have the discipline, right, to follow in it, you'll start noticing what doesn't work about that pipeline, and you keep on improving it. And then if you continue having discipline on that improved pipeline, you'll see what other pipelines are missing as well. And it's a bit of a slower process. I fully acknowledge that. Like it slows teams down a little bit, but in the bigger scheme of things, like when you're going to go over, because in the course of making a game, depending on the scope of it, you're going to go through double, triple digits of certain things that will need to be implemented on from idea to execution. In the grand of scheme of events, having a more detailed pipeline will help you more consistently have results rather than having unpredictability. Basically, it helps you reduce some unpredictability at the expense of speed. So you need to find balance that.
Okay, thanks.